Hi everyone, it's Mr. Lamine again, coming to you live from Sleepy Pup Rescue with Ellie sleeping here nicely on the back, and oh, there's my boy Quincy Dog. They are taking a nice little afternoon nap here with me on a rainy, whatever day of the week it is that you're watching this. You guys win. You've worn me down, and the end of the year is close enough that this will be the final video. I'm going to cram in 1864 and 1865 all together. It's okay. She's very moany whenever she doesn't get attention. But we're going to do the last 2 years together. I'm going to go as quickly as I can to get through this. Thank you to the roughly 24 of you who are still watching. The rest of you who will never see this have worn me down and depressed me enough that though most of the beard is gone and I shaved it up a bit, the depression is not. So we're going to just go ahead and knock this whole thing out. That'll be it. You will do your last few questions on your last activity sheet, which will be the last grade. So if you are trying to get the last few points, this is your opportunity right here. So let's get moving with 1864, the long and deadly year. Just so we remember where we're at, 1863, that is the turning point when the Confederates lose in July, first on July 3rd at Gettysburg, and then on the 4th at Vicksburg. That is the high tide of the Confederacy. It is all downhill from here. This came about because Lee was very successful at Chancellorsville, where he was outnumbered by more than 2-1. Opts to invade the Union again. However, Stonewall Jackson is killed. A lot of historians, or at least Confederate sympathizers today, argue that Jackson being killed at Chancellorsville ends up costing them at Gettysburg because the guys who take over for Jackson are not nearly as good. It's a big gamble. Invading the North again. It didn't hurt him too bad the first time at Antietam, the bloodiest day. This time it really hurts Lee and his army and the Confederate war effort when it fails at Gettysburg. That is, of course, the bloodiest battle in U.S. history, major loss for the rebels. In 1863 as well, we had West Virginia becoming the greatest state of all time in this or any nation on any planet throughout the universe in perpetuity. And then we ended 1863 with one of the most famous speeches of all time, the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln talks about the war effort, the importance. At this point, it's not entirely clear to everyone, but at this point, really, looking back, we can say that the only real chance the Confederates have going forward in 1864 and 1865 is for the Union to quit. The best way for that to happen will be for Lincoln to lose in 1864. So heading into this year, heading into this section, there is an election looming in November of 1864. Heading into that election, Lincoln does not feel very good, does not feel very confident about his chances, knows he needs things to change on the battlefield in order for things to go well at the ballot box. That is really what is left to fight in this war. Can Lincoln get reelected? If so, the Union will win. If not, the Confederacy will probably win. So, to help make this happen, Ulysses S. Grant, who has been fighting pretty successfully in the West, is finally moved to the East. So in the East, now Meade is fired as well, because following the Battle of Gettysburg, he makes the same mistake that McClellan did, and he does not follow Lee. He wins a big battle. He wins the most important battle of the war. And then he just kind of shakes his fist at the Mason-Dixon line and says, "That's right, go back to the South." And then Lincoln is really upset and it's like, "What are you doing, Meade? Why are you so passive? Go fight." He won't, so he gets fired. So this is like our 5th or 6th general. We've had McDowell, we've had Pope, we've had Hooker, we've had Burnside, we've had Meade. Now we have Ulysses S. Grant in charge. And the one thing about Grant is he will fight. He is a fighter, and he will fight and fight and fight. He's very aggressive. He will attack you again and again and again. He is not cautious like a Meade. He's not dumb and reckless like a Burnside. So he's had a lot of success. He's very well known. He's the guy who took Vicksburg. He's had all these victories in the West. So he's coming to the east. The guy who had been his subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, he's going to take over in the west. So Grant is in charge of really the whole army, but he's going to focus on the east. Sherman's going to focus on the west. And what they are going to do is they're not going to focus so much on the Anaconda Plan, partly because the blockade's going well and the taking of the Mississippi is complete, so they don't have to focus on those two parts. But what they're going to focus on is this war of attrition to just grind the Confederates down. Attrition meaning that they are going to wear them out. It's going to be a last man standing kind of situation. And Grant does the math and says, I have hundreds of thousands of more men. I'm going to win that. He's just going to try to deplete the Confederates' troop numbers, wear them out. Just fight and fight and fight and fight and fight. But that is what is going to make this year so long and so bloody. So this is a map. This is an overview of Grant's strategy and enactment of that strategy in the East. He's not worried so much with Richmond, right? It's not the thinking by Grant and of the Union Army at this point has changed. They're not just thinking, hey, if we take Richmond, the war will be over. It is, we have to find Lee, we have to fight Lee, and we have to kill everyone in his army until he doesn't have an army anymore. As long as Lee has an army and is fighting, the war will continue. Okay, well, let's go end Lee. Let's go end his army's ability to fight. So they're going to attack, and they're going to attack, and they're going to attack, and they're going to attack. And so unlike all of these other years, and you can see here what that's going to do to Grant's strength, right? Back with McClellan and Burnside, they had some 200,000 plus men at their disposal. When Grant takes over, it's going to go down and down and down. They're going to replenish. It's going to go down and down and down. Part of that is because it's going to be battle after battle after battle in a very short amount of time. Right, in the past, in 1860, or in the first 3 years of the war, there might be one or two really big battles in the East each year. Right, you have in 62. We have Fredericksburg at the end of the year. We have Antietam. There's normally, a few really big battles, right? There's the couple of times that the Union will try to take Richmond and fail, and then maybe there's a counterattack. So in 63, there's the big attack at Chancellorsville, and then there's the big battle at Gettysburg. In 62, it is the Peninsula Campaign to Antietam. There is actually that third big battle at Fredericksburg. Right, 1861 is Bull Run. 1864 is going to be very different. You can see here the battles that go on. These are all very major battles with huge numbers of troops engaged, huge numbers of casualties, and they are going to happen back to back to back to back to back, almost nonstop. So you are going to get between May 5th and June 9th 4 major battles with other battles in between, and they're not going to end. The last one is the siege of Petersburg. Just like Grant did a siege at Vicksburg, he's going to lay siege to Petersburg, which is south of Richmond. If I don't move my arrow, you can probably see. It's down south of Richmond. You can see on this map, these dotted lines are railroads. So Petersburg is important because it has railroads flowing to it and then flowing to Richmond. But it's not going to end until March 25th of 1865. So Grant is going to be engaged in battle after battle after battle, almost nonstop, for almost a year straight. Wherever Lee goes, Grant will follow. And it doesn't matter to Grant if he wins the battle, if he loses the battle, if it's a tie, he's not leaving the South. He's not leaving Lee alone. So the first battle is the Battle of the Wilderness, 2-day battle, 120,000 troops for Grant, 65,000 for Lee. Inconclusive. It's a tie, essentially. Lee leaves the battlefield. He leaves 11,000 casualties of his own behind. He leaves 17,000 Union casualties. In every other year of the war, whoever's in charge against Lee, whatever Union guy's in charge, would have retreated back to the safety of Washington, D.C., to Maryland and to Pennsylvania. Not Grant. 2 days later, he is fighting Lee again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Again, it's inconclusive. Again, they both take double-digit losses. The Union loses almost 20,000 more guys. Grant, again, does not care. He continues hounding Lee. He follows Lee. Lee retreats further south, trying to get a little bit of space, trying to get a little bit of safety, trying to find more men, more supplies. Grant isn't going to give him the space to breathe. 10 days after that, there's a huge battle at Cold Harbor. This is a loss for Grant. There is over 12,000 Union casualties. There's only 5,000 Confederate losses. But Grant still is not going to leave Lee behind. And in fact, he's already sent part of his army to Petersburg to try to attack, to try to take Petersburg, this important rail junction that leads to Richmond. And then he settles in for a long World War I style, really. A lot of these battles, especially like Cold Harbor and Petersburg, they are going to be World War I style, like siege warfare, trench warfare. One side digs in, the other attacks across no man's land, that kind of stuff. But Grant is just going to not let Lee have any space, have any time, be able to get men together. And he's going to keep the pressure on in the east. On a lot of this whole valley here, the Shenandoah Valley that runs right up through the eastern panhandle, this is where a lot of the food is grown. We're not going to let this part of the country recover. We're going to attack, they're going to attack, they're going to attack. Now, of course, they're grinding Lee's army down, but Grant's army is taking way more casualties every time. We here have just mentioned 3 battles, and you can do the math, right? 17,000, 18,000, 12,000 in 2 months, right? Is it worth it? Is it worth the outcome of grinding Lee down? Is it worth the outcome of winning the war? This is a huge cost, right? Remember, originally the war was sold to the northern public as it's going to be quick, it's going to be easy. We only need volunteers. By this point, most of the guys who are fighting are being drafted. A lot of them don't want to be drafted. They're being drafted. A lot of them don't want to fight for things like emancipating slaves. There are race riots in the North over some of this stuff. So there's a lot of social upheaval. Is it worth it, in your opinion? Why or why not? All right, Battle of Atlanta. Now, while Grant is fighting in the east, Sherman's going to be fighting in the west. It's actually part of their war of attrition. Instead of letting the Confederates use what few guys they have and shuffle them back and forth across from the east to the west, Sherman's going to attack in the west, Grant's going to attack in the east. They're going to do this together. They're going to do it at the same time. They're going to continue to put pressure on. That way, the Confederates are going to be stretched even more thin and ground down even quicker. So, the Atlanta, even though to us that doesn't really sound like it's a Western place, like whenever I say the West, you don't think, oh yeah, I bet he's talking about Atlanta. But in this war, at this point in the war, that's fairly far west in Georgia, Sherman is going to march into Georgia. He is going to take the city of Atlanta. It's a huge boost to Northern morale. They also don't really think of Atlanta as that far in the west, and so they're starting to see, hey, if we give this the time, if we give this a little bit more resources, then we're going to win this war. And so oftentimes the way the Battle of Atlanta is phrased is it assures Lincoln's reelection. At this point, the Northern public is sold enough. You might not like the numbers you're seeing in the paper for casualties day after day after day after day, but you're going, at this point, we're all in. We're all in. And so Sherman takes Atlanta while Grant is bogging Lee down in the east, and it looks like the Confederates are up against the wall, right? If Atlanta, Georgia is the west, there's not much left to the Confederacy. It does let Sherman march to the sea, which we'll do here in a little bit. He is now going to sweep through the rest of the state pretty much unimpeded all the way to the sea, and the size of the functional Confederacy will have dwindled considerably. There won't be much left. So in November of 1864, Lincoln wins re-election. Who's he run against? Who's audacious enough to run against this guy for president? Our old friend and former Union General George B. McClellan. He leads what he calls the Peace Party. That he is part of a faction of the Democrats that are against the war. McClellan is running, saying, hey, elect me, I will end the war. I will recognize the Confederacy. They will be their own country. We will have peace. We cannot win. McClellan's platform is, we cannot win this war. Trust me, I know. I was a general in it. Trust me, I know. Lincoln's an idiot. So elect me, I'll end the war, I'll end the suffering, I'll end his tyranny. We won't worry about slavery. We won't worry about emancipation, any of that. We'll let the Confederacy be the Confederacy and have its slaves. We won't have to worry about any of that. We'll stop the bloodshed. By the time the voters get to the ballot box in November of 1864 or thereabout, the war is going well enough, even though it's crazy bloody and tens of thousands of people are being shot, every couple of days. The Northern public is saying, well, the Confederacy can be defeated. They are being defeated. They will be defeated if we elect Lincoln. And so Lincoln easily wins. Obviously, the Confederacy is not allowed to vote in this because they don't think they're part of the United States. Lincoln wins almost every state, other than New Jersey, of course, Delaware and Kentucky. So in the Electoral College, it's a whooping, 91%. To 9%. It's a lot closer in the popular vote. It's 2.2 million to 1.8 million, so it's 55-45. But in elections, that's actually pretty big. That's a pretty big disparity, 10 points there. So the tide of the war has now turned permanently in the North's favor. Lincoln has easily won. The Confederates are really kind of out of They're really out of options. No one in Europe is going to recognize them. They're a sinking ship. Everyone seems to recognize that they're a sinking ship. There's not a lot of options left. So the last part of 1864 here, Sherman, after he has liberated Atlanta, he is now going to march to the sea to Savannah, Georgia, and he is going to attack and destroy everything. This is what he calls total war. This is not just war on an army. In fact, there really is no Confederate army in this part of the country anymore. After Atlanta falls, the Confederates don't have much of an army anywhere. There's a tiny one out in Texas, and Lee still has a small contingent in Petersburg, but there's not much of a Confederate army left, and there is no one to stand in his way. Normally, at this point in history, you go fight against an army, and that's it. But Sherman recognizes this isn't just about defeating an army, because this is a rebellion. This is a civil war. This is about defeating the ideology of the Confederacy. And so he is going to make war on anything and everything that symbolizes the Confederacy. So he's going to attack and destroy any military targets. So obviously that would be army, but there's not much of an army. But if there is anything that's aiding the army, he's going to attack and destroy it. But he's not going to just limit it to that. It's also going to be industrial. So any sort of manufacturing that he can come across, infrastructure. He's going to destroy. Famously, they rip up the railroads and they make Sherman bow ties, which is when they would. Oh, that's the UPS lady's here. Ellie. She hates visitors. The army would rip up the railroad and heat up some of the iron links in the railroad and then wrap it around the tree to ruin it. And that way, they would ruin the Confederacy's infrastructure. They can't move people. They can't move goods. They can't move supplies. This part of Georgia is being laid waste to. And he also did target civilians, not poor civilians, not slaves, but if they came across plantations, if they came across really the rich, he would torch the plantations and he would set the slaves free. And so really he was making war on the Confederacy, not just its army, but the people. Now, he did this very impressively. with no supply lines. So he marched, it's not a crazy long march, but it's all the way across the state of Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah down here underneath my face, in a fairly wide stretch, and they lived off the land. So all the food, they just took it. They needed food, they needed water, they needed supplies, they needed rations, anything they needed or wanted, they just took, destroying everything in this part of the country. A lot of people very angry, very upset, and in fact, anger and resentment lingered for quite some time in the South over this, because people said, "Well, this is unnecessary. This is not, this is against the rules of war. This is, you know, not how you do things." But Sherman wanted to drive the point home. This is, you've lost. The Confederacy has lost. There's nothing you can do about this. You're going to come back into the Union. Slavery is going to be dead, and your ability to ever do this again will be shattered. So, my question to you: how should we view this kind of thing? This kind of action? It was gratuitous violence laid on essentially defenseless people at this point. But the way Sherman viewed it was they brought it on themselves. So was this necessary? Was it ethical? Was this the right way to act in a war? How should we view Sherman and the Union Army marching from Atlanta to Savannah, just laying waste to everything that they come across? And that's 1864. Let's real quick go through 1865, the end of the war, and a little bit beyond. So, in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment is going to be passed. That abolishes slavery. Lincoln has made this a central plank, right, of the war. His overall goal, obviously, has always been reunion, get the country back together. But he's decided, as have a lot of radical Republicans at this point, they've decided the only way that this is going to work, the only way that the Union's going to stay together, is if we reunite without slavery. It doesn't make sense to reunite with slavery, because then what was the war about? If the seeds of what brought upon this divorce are still there, then they will ripen once again into the fruit of secession. So Lincoln pushes very hard and pulls out every political trick he can to get this amendment passed. That is actually what the movie Lincoln is about. There's not any fighting in it. It's just Lincoln pushing as hard as he can, using as much pressure, as much of his political capital and will, guile, cunning, dirty tricks, kind of bribery to certain people, to get this amendment passed. And he does on January 31st. After the war is over, two other amendments are going to be passed, the 14th and the 15th. Collectively, these three amendments are known as the Civil War Amendments, but the 14th and the 15th grant citizenship to former slaves and voting rights. So the 14th Amendment says that you are a citizen if you're born here. That's where birthright citizenship comes from. It says you are a citizen if you were born here, regardless of if you used to be a slave. And then the 15th says you have the right to vote if you're a citizen. Of course, especially the 15th Amendment, but to a lesser extent, the 13th and the 14th as well. The South is going to try to find creative ways in the future to take these freedoms away. So famously, especially in the South, they're going to start to criminalize a lot of behaviors right after the Civil War. And what's the punishment? If you are convicted of being a vagrant, of loitering, of being unemployed, of breaking an employment contract, well, you get rented out as a field hand. So essentially slavery for committing really no crime at all. The crime of not being a slave, you become a slave. The 15th Amendment, the South is going to put on like a grandfather clause on and reading tests. And they're going to say, hey, you can vote. Everyone can vote, but you have to pass this reading test first. We know who can't read? Former slaves. Well, there's a lot of poor whites who can't read either, so they put in these clauses that say, but if your grandfather could vote, you can vote. So a former slave, obviously, none of their grandfathers could vote. They were slaves. And they can't read because they were slaves. So it's a way of finding loopholes, really. The South, that's what's going to be the next stage in American history, is going to be people trying to find loopholes and then other people trying to close those loopholes on giving rights to first former slaves and then all people of that are African American, all African Americans. And it's not going to just be in the South. It's not going to just be in the South. That's one of the big pet peeves of the South, is that the North always acts holier than thou. And the North has a pretty bad history with race relations as well. But the South is going to be the biggest offender, and they kind of like to say, well, what about the North, to, distract and confuse you. But, the South is going to be pretty bad, but that's going to be going forward. So what you guys will get in 11th grade history, if you take it, the time after this, called Reconstruction, is going to be a quick whiplashing of African Americans get a lot of rights and then lose a lot of rights, and there's going to be a long buildup. Had we gotten this time period right by our standards of correct, there never would have needed to be a civil rights movement like Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff would not have been fighting for voting rights 100 years later, right? It is literally going to be until like 1964, 1965 that there's big major legislation again to address this stuff that we thought we took care of with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but we did not, because you can pass laws, but you can't change men's hearts, unfortunately. Now, let's end the war. April 9th. Lee is going to surrender. So there is a little town called Appomattox Courthouse. That's the name of the town, Appomattox Courthouse. This is where the final little engagement's going to be. Lee is surrounded. He is down to 28,000 guys. There is a small bit of a Confederate army in North Carolina, and Lee would like to link up with that army, but he gets cut off. He gets surrounded, and he opts to surrender. He could, if he wanted, try one last big battle, but he's outnumbered nearly 4-1. Doesn't want to do that. He realizes that's just wasting lives. He could order his men into the hills, especially places like West Virginia and Appalachia, and tell them to fight a guerrilla war and just prolong this thing forever. Doesn't want to do that, so he opts to surrender. So on April 9th, General Lee meets with General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse inside a house. Ironically, he meets in the parlor of a man who used to live at Bull Run, but moved because the war got in his way. In fact, the part of the Battle of Bull Run was fought in his backyard. So the joke always was that this guy, the war started in his backyard and ended in his front parlor, because they literally signed the surrender in this guy's house. Lee, though, surrenders his army. Grant, and he's talked about this with Lincoln, about how are we going to handle the end of this war. He's very magnanimous. He says to the Confederate soldiers, give me your guns, go home. That's it. Go home. Here's some food, because Lee's army is pretty well out of supplies at this point. Go home. Go home. We're not going to arrest everyone. We're not going to keep you as prisoners. Go home. It's April. Go back to your farms. Get back to life as normal. Realize that you lost the war. The war is over. You were lucky enough to survive. Don't make any more trouble. Go home. The only people that Lincoln and Grant and some of the Republicans in charge want to see, like a trial for or anything, maybe, are guys like Lee and Jefferson Davis. So, Lee, they're not going to just say, oh, okay, no hard feelings, you can go home. He's never actually going to get in any trouble, but they're going to say, to the men, you're not going to get in trouble. Lee, you might get in trouble. Normal soldiers, go home. Just get out of here. Now, my question to you is, and this is a very controversial topic today, how should we remember Robert E. Lee? Defend your opinion. I want to know. How should we remember this guy? He undoubtedly was a great general. He won a bunch of battles. He won a lot more battles than he lost. He was outnumbered, outgunned, didn't have great supplies, didn't have great infrastructure, didn't have a great government behind him, but he also led the Confederate Army. He was offered to lead the Union Army and said, "No, I'm going to fight with Virginia. I cannot fight against Virginia." So, how should we remember this guy? Just give me a little defense. Why? Why do you see him the way you do? All right. And this is the biggest tragedy, not just because a great man is assassinated, but it happens 5 days after the war unofficially ends, right? The war is unofficially over on April 9th. April 14th, Lincoln is assassinated by an actor, actually a pretty famous actor at the time too, named John Wilkes Booth. I like to say it would be like if you got a Google alert all of a sudden telling you that Brad Pitt had shot the president. That would be very shocking. Pretty messed up. Happens at a theater. Lincoln goes to a play called Our American Cousin. It's a comedy. Goes with his wife and a friend and his wife, and they are up in their box. And John Wilkes Booth has hatched a plan, not just to kill Lincoln, but to kill everyone at the top of the government. So they're trying to kill the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State, William Seward. They're trying to kill a number of cabinet members, and it's going to go down all at the same time. The reason for this is John Wilkes Booth is a Confederate sympathizer and heard a speech from Lincoln. And Lincoln pretty much said, we need to make African Americans citizens, and we need to give them the right to vote. And John Wilkes Booth was so aghast at this that he decided on the spot, we're going to kill this guy. He had actually been planning to kidnap Lincoln. His kind of plan seemed to be he was going to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom. The ransom was going to be to help the Confederacy continue the war. Now he just decided, no, he's got to die. If he wants non-white people to be citizens and be able to vote and stuff, he's too dangerous to be left alive, to quote Mace Windu. So he decides we're going to kill Lincoln, but we're also going to cut off the whole head of the government. We're going to kill the next couple people in line to succeed President Lincoln. That way, hopefully, that the Confederacy can get a little bit of breathing space, can recover, and maybe can continue on with the war. So, on the night of April 14th, after the play has started, John Wilkes Booth enters Ford Theater. Now, of course, nobody thinks anything of this because he's an actor inside a theater. He knows the play that's going on very well, and so he waits until the biggest joke of the entire play takes place, and as everyone is laughing, he sneaks behind Lincoln in his box and shoots him in the back of the head. He then makes the curious decision to jump from the balcony in the box down towards the stage, breaks his ankle, and yells something. There's a number of different things that he's supposed to have yelled. Normally what gets quoted is he yells the Latin phrase sic semper tyrannus, meaning as are always such to tyrants. So he jumps down, he pulls the trigger, jumps down, breaks his ankle, and then limps on out of there. I don't know how nobody stopped him, but he gets away. He goes on the run. Lincoln, everyone's in shock. They drag Lincoln. He's unconscious but alive across the street, where he lingers throughout the night, unconscious, and then dies the next day. Booth is on the run for a while, is found around 2 weeks later on April 26th, cornered in a barn in Maryland. The army surrounds him, says, "Come on out." He says, "No, thank you." They set the barn on fire, and then they shoot him while he's in the barn. So the fire is shooting at him, to quote Andy Bernard. So he dies. A number of other people either chicken out of the plan to assassinate the people they're supposed to, or they fail. For example, the guy who attacks the Secretary of State, William Seward, slashes him up good, slashes his son up good. They don't die. The guy who's supposed to kill the vice president chickens out. So nobody else in the government is killed, unfortunately. Or I guess fortunately for us, other than the vice president, I really don't like. So maybe unfortunately there. But unfortunately, Lincoln is killed. Fortunately, no one else is. All right, so the final surrender of this war. President Davis is going to be captured in Georgia on May the 10th. That is what is pictured in the drawing here. I know that looks like a woman in a dress, and that is because Davis was allegedly found in his wife's dress, in drag, trying to escape, hoping to not be recognized, in a headscarf and dress. Of course, he was, and I don't know that he actually ever did that, but that was the story that was told. So he surrenders. So there goes the president, and the final little army of the Confederacy surrenders in Texas on June the 2nd. And that's it. There's no treaty or anything for this war because it is a rebellion. It's not a treaty is signed between two countries. And since we're not recognizing the Confederacy as a country, and since it's not even going to be a thing to allege to be a country anymore, there is no treaty. It just kind of ends. And unfortunately, Lincoln, worked so hard and ultimately gave his life to win this war, and misses the very, very, very end of it. It is now going to be up to Andrew Johnson, who is probably the worst president, or he's one of the worst presidents of all time. My least favorite. He has to run things. Now, aftermath, consequences, just about done. We're talking 620,000 dead at the low end, right? Up to 750,000 dead on a little higher end. Plus, we're talking 50,000-ish civilians, maybe more. Kind of hard to get a take there. So we're talking upwards of close to 1 million people dead. Again, 1 million people dead is an astronomically high number. And that was at a time when the population of the United States is much, much lower. We're talking if a commensurate event were to take place today, we're talking 6, 7 million Americans dead. Huge numbers, right? You got to remember the state of West Virginia only has 1.5 million people in it, or 1.8 million or so in it today. So close, to maybe half-ish of the population of West Virginia today killed in this war. That doesn't include the maimed and the injured and the psychologically tormented. So this is going to touch every household in America. Everyone has a brother, a father, a husband, a cousin, an uncle dead or wounded from this war. That's the bad. The good, slavery is abolished legally forever. The states that seceded, if they want to come back in, we make them ratify the 13th Amendment. You want to have a government again? You want to be officially a state again? Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, you have to officially acknowledge that slavery is no more. So the cause of the war is addressed. It is very bloody. It takes a long time and a lot of fighting, but the root cause of the war is addressed. Lincoln's assassinated, one of the greatest presidents of all time, fantastic leader, a great mind, is lost. And unfortunately, what's even worse than that, the guy that follows him is not just like bad because he's like not Lincoln. He's just not a great dude. So that is a huge loss. And really, a lot of times I like to say that the two things America has really got wrong was, one was the start of slavery, right? That caused a ton of problems for us, and the way we handled the end of slavery. And one of the reasons that we botched the end of slavery, right? Obviously, getting rid of slavery is good, but we didn't do much other than just say, hey, you're not a slave anymore. And that was it. And a lot of that was because Lincoln is dead. There's not going to be any sort of program. There's not going to be any sort of oversight for the most part to address, okay, now what? Right? You technically cut the shackles of the slaves, but now what? Right? A lot of that gets botched because of Andrew Johnson, at least in my opinion. The Union, again, another good one. The Union is reunited and preserved. We're not going to have two countries. Could have been a very dangerous situation, right? First you have two, then maybe you have three, or four, or whatever. Maybe we get into more wars with each other. The counterfactuals going forward. Could we have won World War II? Right? Could the United States have helped win World War II and defeated Hitler if we were two different countries? Things like that. You can go down a real deep rabbit hole there about all the good that comes out of that. But that is a good that comes out of that. And then you have the situation we have today where the states are permanently subordinate to the central government. In our mind, we think about America first and West Virginia second, right? Most of the time people, when they say, hey, where are you from? If they're from another country, you're not going to say West Virginia. You're not going to identify West Virginia as your country, or Oklahoma as your country. You're American. We care a lot more about the president than we do the mayor of Morgantown or the governor of West Virginia. A lot of that starts to happen here. Before the Civil War, people didn't think too much about the national government, and it wasn't very powerful. There were great presidents, guys like Jefferson, Washington, Jackson, powerful presidents, but they weren't that powerful. Today, the central government, the national government, the federal government, crazy powerful compared to the states. And that happens because of this war. Right? The other thing, though, you have tons of wounded men. Most of them have suffer amputations, like the guys here. Sometimes single, sometimes double. Things like prosthetics come a long, long way that you can't see because my head's in the way. But like this guy has spoons and forks on the end of his prosthetic arm. Before, it was literally like a peg leg. Now, because you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who've suffered amputations, you have much better prosthetics. Obviously not good by our standards, but much better prosthetics. But you also have, the dead. Thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dead. This is the cemetery in Gettysburg, and yeah, there are a lot of headstones that are like this one that just say unknown, 143 bodies, because there was no identifying them. So unfortunately, the nation was bestricken with grief because a lot of people lost someone. A lot of people didn't know where they were. Never got to see them again. Never got to get that closure, go through those rites and ceremonies that you go through when someone dies. So we were a traumatized nation in a lot of ways, psychologically, from the war. I would argue that we kind of botched a lot of the ways we handled the end of the war after Lincoln is killed. But we are one united country with a powerful government, and slavery has been abolished. So a lot of good does come out of it. Now, to you, the last question of the year that I have for you guys, all things considered, was this war necessary? Was it worth it? Why or why not? And then our very last slide. So just a few more changes. Things like secession. You hear them every once in a while, right? Texas, California. You hear people talk about the scary S word, but it's not really taken that seriously anymore. We'll see going forward. There could always be another crisis of secession, but the idea of it is not nearly as widespread. The philosophy behind it, all of it kind of gets discredited with this war. For a long, long time, people like John C. Calhoun argued, it's right, it's possible, it's legal, it can happen. We tested it. It lost in the war, and so a lot of people have thought, well, if not might makes right. Lincoln liked to argue that right makes might. So he was right, therefore he won the war. Secession is gone. Federal government, much, much, much more powerful. Taxes, drafts, stuff like that start to become normalized. The government, the president being the most powerful guy by far in the country, all of that starts to become very normalized. The northern economy booms. The southern one tanks. Even today, there is a big difference in living in the north and living in the south. And a lot of that has traces not just to the Civil War, but way before the Civil War. But the Civil War economically does have a big impact on the North and the South. The South is where almost all the fighting was. The South is where almost all the damage was. The South had put so much money into slavery. Now they've lost all of that. So things are not good in the South, and they will not be good in the South economically for a long time. Cities have continued to grow, and people have continued to move west. If you are an ex-Confederate soldier and you come back to the South and life's terrible there and there's not a market and there's not enough labor, what do? Well, you're probably going west. Maybe you're going to go find a city out west. The South has to find a new way of life, a new identity, really, because they don't have slavery anymore. They're going to cast about for a while. Really, what's going to happen long term is the guys who were in charge of the South before the Civil War are going to be the same guys in charge of the South after the Civil War. Andrew Johnson opts to not really punish any of those people. Guys like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, they're not going to be put in jail for long periods of time. They're not going to be hanged. They're not going to be shot by firing squad. Really, nothing's going to happen to most of them. In fact, a lot of them are going to get their citizenship back. They're going to get their voting rights back. Even a guy like Robert E. Lee posthumously got his citizenship back. So, there's not a lot of change there. But they are going to have to find a new way of life, a new way of labor, now that slavery is gone. But you get a ton of other things, right? Some of it we live with today, like the rise of paper money. Others we still unfortunately live with today, like the rise of the KKK. So, but if you look it up, if you're interested, there are 1,000,001 ways in which the Civil War changed the way Americans lived up to the way we live today. Where we live, how we live, economically, socially, all sorts of things, politically especially, all sorts of things come about. Our relationship to government, everything really changes. This is an inflection point, huge thing, wildly important, probably the single most important event in our history, which is why it is the culminating event of this class. Now, with that, I am done. Most of you have logged off long ago, which is unfortunate. It makes me very sad, but to the couple dozen of you, if that, watch this video, make it all the way through, I thank you. It means the world to me that you're still watching. Those few of you who reach out and whatnot, it really does help keep me going during this time. So I appreciate that as well. Hopefully you got a little bit from this video, from this whole series, from this class. If you need the points, want the points, you can turn in the final activity sheet as soon as you're done with all of this. If you need more points and you haven't done all the Arctic Day stuff, do that, turn it in. But if you guys ever need anything, have any questions, feel free to reach out. Assuming we're ever back in school, my door is always open, although it is technically locked, but you are all welcome at any time. So come up to the 4th floor if you're in good enough shape, and give me a ring whenever. I'm always around. So thank you for watching this, and I hope you guys have a great last week or so of school and a fantastic summer. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane, and I'll see you around.